This last part of this chapter, we're going to deal with the intellectual history of the colonies, and we're going to start with religion. The colonists were much more religiously diverse than Europe. The official religion of Virginia, Maryland, New York, the Carolina, and Georgia was Anglican. That's Henry VIII's religion, where he replaced himself with the Pope. But this was largely ignored. This was the legal religion, but people generally tended to practice what they wanted to. Even in New England, where the Puritans, of course, had moved there to make everybody a Puritan, we begin to see cracks in different religions and denominations sprout up. In New York and New Jersey, which of course used to be Dutch, right, we begin to see Dutch Reformed become a major religion in that area. Baptists flourished, which was kind of a new denomination. And we begin to see a great debate among Protestants. Remember, before they had believed in predestination. God decided if you were saved before you were born. But many Protestants now will start arguing free will. Basically, God looks at the totality of your decisions. Are you a good person or a bad person? And decides if you'll get into heaven. And that ends up being a really big and important fight. Catholics are still not tolerated virtually anywhere. In fact, America tended to see Canada as agents of Rome and highly Catholic because, of course, it's French history and competitors. So we're very dubious about Canada. Even in Maryland, which, of course, had been founded for the Catholics, if you remember, John Coode had run the Calverts out of Maryland. And after 1691, when Maryland officially stops being the property of the Calverts, Maryland's 3,000 Catholics began being persecuted by the official government there. There are Jews in the colonies, although there's only about 2,000 in all the colonies. But in New York City has the largest concentration, and still today New York City has a significant and important Jewish population. Only Rhode Island has true religious freedom. In fact, only Rhode Island allows Jewish worshippers to openly practice. But even in Rhode Island, as well as every other colony, Jews cannot hold office or vote. So there's generally religious discrimination, particularly if you're a non-Christian religion. Or non-Protestant, really. By 1700s, mobility, prosperity, and the rise of science had begun to severely weaken religion. The early 1700s was a period where people turned away from religion. And so a group of Puritan ministers will begin preaching what are called Jeremiads, which are basically sermons where they argue that we've turned away from God and we're going to pay a terrible price for this. These Jeremiads will lead to the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is really important. This begins in the 1730s, its peak is in the 1740s, and it fades out by the 1750s. This is a revival in religion. What is being awakened is people's belief in God, their religious feeling. It primarily appeals to those who don't have much power, women and second sons, people who aren't going to inherit a lot of property. They preached a personal relationship with God, and they wanted to empower their believers. They moved away from predestination towards free will, which was a great message if you're one of these people who had been told all along that you weren't one of the elites and God wasn't interested in having you in heaven. The big figures here are going to be John and Charles Wesley. I put John on here. You can see him there. They founded a religion called Methodism, which is still a major religion in America today. And they were English, but they toured the U.S. and preached all over the place. George Whitefield drew enormous crowds. But the most famous and probably important preacher of the movement was Jonathan Edwards. He was from Massachusetts, and he was a fire and brimstone preacher, meaning he preached about if you don't do what God says, you're going to go to hell. This Great Awakening led to a fight among religious types between the New Lights and the Old Lights. The Old Lights were the old Protestants who believed in predestination. The New Lights were the new Protestants who believed in an even more personal and direct relationship with God and believed that the weight of your actions will get you into heaven or to hell. It was an anti-intellectual movement. It attacked book learning. It was an anti-scientific movement in many ways, although it did lead to the founding of a number of colleges to train Great Awakening ministers, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Enlightenment was a movement that began in Europe and spread to the United States, where people began to turn away from religion to find answers to questions and turn towards human logic and reason, or what they called at the time natural laws. Now, these people were religious, I should stress, although they may have belonged to some different religious groups like deism, which I'll explain later. So it wasn't necessarily an anti-religious movement. It was just a different way of thinking about the world. They encouraged people to develop their intellect and use the scientific method to find answers. They borrowed their ideas from Europe. Until the American Revolution, America did not have a lot of original thinkers. But one we should mention is Benjamin Franklin, who became the most important man in America and the most famous American in the world due to his his scientific accomplishments. He was a celebrity in Europe. By 1776, half of white men in America could read. We had done a pretty good job relative to the rest of the world of educating our population. Women weren't really taught to read, so not many women could read. There were very few colleges at this point. And most of the reading that was done in America was of almanacs. There were dozens and dozens of different almanacs published. Most families had an almanac, even poor families. They had medical advice, information on how to navigate using the stars, agricultural information. They would often try to predict the weather for every day of the year. It was never accurate, of course, but people believed this stuff. It had wisdom and humor, predictions about all kinds of things that were going to happen, which virtually never came true. The most popular almanac in America was Poor Richard's Almanac, which was written by Benjamin Franklin. He was Poor Richard. And this is actually the thing that first brought Benjamin Franklin to fame and wealth. He was a printer, and Poor Richard's Almanac success made him. In 1639, we have the first colonial printing press. And by 1695, we have more printing presses in America than there are in England. And so we're a very literate society for the time. And in 1690, we see public occurrences over here. This is the first American newspaper, first newspaper published in the colonies. It only ran for one issue, but it was followed by other newspapers. In 1647, Massachusetts had passed a law requiring that every town support a school. And so the people of Massachusetts, the boys anyway, white boys, began to be educated. Quakers tended to run the schools. Widows and single women would run what were called dame schools, which were schools that they ran out of their house. Craftsmen in the cities would run night schools for apprentices. If you were a young man, you would go apprentice with a craftsman, a cobbler who made shoes or something. And then at night, they would have schools that taught you how to read. Very few African Americans or Native Americans became literate. And in fact, fairly quickly it became illegal to teach a slave how to read. Here are the first colleges in America. Harvard in 1636 is the first college. Remember, it was trained to teach Puritan ministers how to argue so they wouldn't lose fights to women because of Anne Hutchinson. Next comes William and Mary. This is where Thomas Jefferson went to school. It's in Virginia, named after, of course, William and Mary. Next is William and Mary's Anglican, by the way. In 1701, Yale opened up. Yale is a Congregationalist college that was opened by breakaway Puritans who founded this new sect and were unhappy with Harvard because it was apparently too Puritan. And so Yale was founded in opposition to Harvard. It's in Connecticut. In 1746 in New Jersey, we get Princeton. This is one of those Great Awakening colleges. In fact, Jonathan Edwards was the president of it for a while. Colleges taught theology, logic, ethics, physics, geometry, astrology, rhetoric, astronomy, rhetoric, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Sounds fun, huh? The first non-religious college in the colonies was King's College in 1754, and it had no religious affiliation. Today, King's College is called Columbia, and it's in Harlem in New York City. The next year, Penn opens up. This is the University of Pennsylvania, not Penn State. It's also secular, and it was founded in part by Benjamin Franklin. Before these colleges began to open up, the tradition was rich guys would go to England or go back to Europe and get a college education, then return to the colonies. Now they could go to college here in the colonies, but it is true that only rich white guys got to go to college. It was very expensive. Very, very few people could go to college. Colleges taught Newton and Copernicus, who were great Enlightenment thinkers. Many colleges joined the many colonists, I should say, joined the Royal Society of London, the world-famous scientific society. Ben Franklin caused a sensation by proving that lightning and electricity are the same thing. This is his flying the kite experiment. Franklin also invented bifocals, eyeglasses with two different lenses, a new type of stove that was less likely to burn down your house, and some people claim that he invented flippers like you swim with. Another great scientific achievement of the colonists is Cotton Mather in 1720 creates the first inoculation for smallpox. You know how you get a shot that prevents you from getting a disease? Cotton Mather invented that, and he's a Massachusetts minister. He's also the guy who oversaw the Salem witch trials. Finally, we should talk about the Zenger trial. In 1724, a man named John Peter Zenger published a newspaper that was critical of the king, and he was charged with treason for this. And his lawyers argued that what Zenger had published was true, so he can't be published for it. And the idea that truth is a defense against libel is invented here in America. So the idea that you can criticize the government as long as you're not lying is an American concept. Each colony had developed its own government by then to run day-to-day affairs. You just couldn't run day-to-day things from England if you're here in the colonies. And so this is going to be important because in this period after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the colonies are going to develop a strong sense of independence because they basically run themselves. We call this period salutary neglect. And it's going to be England's attempt to end this period that's going to lead to the American Revolution. All right, that's it for Chapter 3.